They had watched this footage 100 times before. Every frame, every shadow, every second slowed down, paused, replayed. And every single time they reached the same conclusion. Nothing was there. The case was closed. The files were boxed. The suspect was buried under paperwork and time. But 7 years later, one exhausted analyst noticed something so small, so ordinary, that no one else had ever questioned it. A detail hiding in plain sight. A detail that shouldn't have existed. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Because this wasn't just a recording. It was a silent witness. And it had been telling the truth the entire time. The night the crime happened, the city was unusually quiet. No rain. No traffic. No witnesses screaming or running. Just a narrow service road behind a row of closed shops, dimly lit by a single flickering street light that had been malfunctioning for months. At 11:47 p.m., a man named Daniel Cross walked into that street. And he never walked out. Daniel was 34 years old. No criminal record. No enemies, at least none that anyone could find. He worked as a logistics coordinator for a shipping company, a job that paid enough to live comfortably but not enough to attract attention. He wasn't famous. He wasn't powerful. He wasn't someone you'd expect to end up in a true crime documentary. Which is exactly why his death confused everyone. At 6:12 a.m. the next morning, a sanitation worker found Daniel's body behind a dumpster, partially hidden as if someone had tried, and failed, to make him disappear. The injuries were brutal. Multiple blunt force impacts. Signs of a struggle. But no weapon at the scene. No wallet. No phone. Just a wristwatch still ticking. The time of death was estimated between 11:50 p.m. and 12:10 a.m. And that's when investigators found the CCTV camera. Mounted high on the corner of a hardware store, angled downward, recording the service road 24 hours a day. It was old. Low resolution. Black and white. But it worked. And it had recorded everything. At first the footage seemed useless. A grainy street. Flickering light. Occasional stray cat crossing the frame. At 11:46 p.m., Daniel appears on screen, entering from the left side. He walks normally. No sign of fear. No one following him. At 11:48 p.m. he stops near the dumpster. And then, this is where things get strange. The camera doesn't clearly show what happens next. Daniel moves partially out of frame. There's motion. Shadows. A sudden collapse. And then nothing. No clear attacker. No identifiable face. No dramatic moment where you can point and say, that's the killer. By 12:03 a.m., the street is empty again. That was it. 14 minutes of footage. Zero answers. The investigation moved fast. Too fast, some would later say. Police questioned co-workers, neighbors, former classmates. They traced Daniel's last phone call to a man named Evan Reed, a former business partner who had separated from Daniel 2 years earlier after a financial dispute. Evan had motive. Money disagreements. Anger. Unresolved tension. He was brought in for questioning. Evan denied everything. Said he hadn't seen Daniel in months. Said he was home that night alone. No alibi that could be confirmed. No evidence that could directly place him at the scene. But investigators were under pressure. Public pressure. Media pressure. Department pressure. A man was dead and people wanted answers. When they replayed the CCTV footage during Evan's interrogation, he leaned forward. He watched closely. And then he said something that would later be ignored. He said, "I've seen this before." They asked him what he meant. He shrugged and said, "Nothing. Just looks familiar." At the time it meant nothing. Years later it would mean everything. Without enough evidence, prosecutors hesitated. The case stalled. No arrest. No trial. Eventually, Daniel Cross became another unsolved homicide, filed, archived, forgotten by everyone except one person. Daniel's younger brother, Michael Cross. Michael refused to let it go. He requested copies of the police reports. He studied the autopsy photos. He watched the CCTV footage until he could recite every second from memory. And yet, even he couldn't see what was missing. The footage showed what happened. But it didn't explain how it happened. Or why. 7 years passed. The street was renovated. The camera was replaced. The hardware store shut down. Life moved on. Until one night, a routine audit reopened the file. The analyst assigned to review old unsolved cases was a man named Mark Hale. Mark wasn't a detective. He wasn't chasing glory. He was methodical. Obsessive. The kind of person who noticed patterns others ignored. He had one rule. Never trust the conclusion. Trust the details. Mark loaded the footage onto his workstation and watched it once. Then again. Then again. On the fourth viewing he noticed something strange, not about Daniel, not about the shadows, but about the environment. The light. That flickering street light. It flickered in a pattern. Every 6 seconds. Except, during a 9-second window the pattern broke. The light stayed on. Uninterrupted. Mark froze the frame. Zoomed in. Enhanced contrast. And asked himself a simple question. What? Streetlights don't change patterns randomly. Electrical faults are consistent. Unless something interferes. Something blocks the sensor. Something moves. But according to the footage no one else was there. At least no one visible. Mark overlaid timestamps. Compared frames. Then he noticed something even more unsettling. Daniel's shadow. It behaved strangely. At 11:49 p.m., Daniel's shadow stretches toward the dumpster. At 11:50 p.m., the shadow splits. Not into two people. Into two directions. One consistent with the street light. The other, impossible. Mark leaned back in his chair. Because shadows don't lie. And shadows don't appear without a source. Someone was there. Close. Close enough to block the light. Close enough to touch Daniel. But positioned perfectly outside the camera's field of view. Someone who knew exactly where the camera couldn't see. Mark requested the original footage, not the compressed copy. The raw file. What he found inside the metadata changed everything. The camera had skipped 2 frames. Not corrupted. Deleted. Manually. At 11:49 and 32 seconds p.m. Someone had accessed the camera system before the footage was archived. Someone with admin privileges. Someone who knew how to clean a crime scene digitally. That meant one thing. This wasn't a random attack. This was planned. Calculated. And the killer wasn't just on the street that night. He was inside the system. When Mark reopened the case, the department was reluctant. 7 years was a long time. Witnesses forget. Evidence degrades. People move on. But Mark didn't ask for permission. He asked one question. Who had access to this camera? The answer came back within hours. 3 people. The store owner. A private security contractor. And a former systems consultant who had installed the camera years earlier. His name was Evan Reed. The same Evan Reed. The man who had said, "I've seen this before." Because he had. He built it. And that was when Mark understood something chilling. The footage didn't fail. It did exactly what it was designed to do. It hid the truth in plain sight. And now, after all these years, it was finally ready to tell it. Mark Hale didn't confront Evan Reed right away. That's what Evan would have expected. Men like Evan don't fear questions. They fear patience. Mark spent 3 weeks doing nothing visible. No calls. No interviews. No warrants. Just observation. He reconstructed Evan's life from the shadows. Financial records, employment history, movement patterns. Evan had never fully disappeared after Daniel Cross's death. He had evolved. New consulting firms. Short-term contracts. Always dealing with surveillance systems, back-end security, infrastructure no one noticed unless it failed. Evan didn't break systems. He designed them. That's when Mark realized the most dangerous criminals don't run from cameras. They hide inside them. Mark replayed the CCTV footage again, this time not watching Daniel, but imagining Evan. Where would he stand? Where would he avoid? He mapped the camera's blind zones using architectural plans from the city archives. And there it was. A narrow triangular pocket near the dumpster, just wide enough for one man to stand unseen. A place where shadows would betray presence without revealing shape. The perfect place to kill someone quietly. But planning the location wasn't the most disturbing part. Planning the aftermath was. Mark re-examined the autopsy. Daniel's injuries showed controlled force, not rage. No wild blows. No defensive wounds on Evan's side. This wasn't a fight. It was a correction. Evan didn't attack Daniel because he was angry. He attacked him because Daniel was disruptive. Daniel had found something buried in shipping manifests. Small inconsistencies, repeated routing anomalies, shipments that existed on paper but never moved physically. Ghost shipments. Money laundering through logistics infrastructure. Daniel didn't understand the full picture. But he understood enough to ask questions. And Evan Reed was the kind of man who removed questions. What happened that night wasn't spontaneous. Daniel didn't panic when he reached the service road. Because he wasn't meeting a stranger. He was meeting someone he trusted. Someone who had called him earlier that evening. Someone whose number was saved, but later erased. Evan didn't drag Daniel to the dumpster. Daniel walked there willingly. Because Evan told him he could explain everything. Mark found proof of that call. Not in phone records, but in the cell tower handshake logs. A brief, encrypted exchange at 11:32 p.m. Evan had used a spoof device. But he'd made one mistake. He reused an old encryption key. A key he had registered years earlier during a legitimate contract. Systems forget. Patterns don't. When Mark finally brought Evan in for questioning, Evan looked calm. Almost amused. 7 years had made him confident. Time protects men like him. Mark didn't accuse. He talked. About work. About how systems age. About how people assume cameras always tell the truth. Evan listened. Smiled. Then Mark slid a single image across the table. A still frame from the CCTV footage. Not of Daniel. Of the shadow. Split. Impossible. Evan's smile didn't fade. But his breathing changed. Just slightly. That was enough. You planned it to look incomplete, Mark said calmly. People trust gaps. They stop looking. Evan leaned back. You don't have a murder weapon, he said. No witness. No confession. Mark nodded. You're right, he said. But I have intent. And I have design. Evan laughed softly. Design isn't illegal. No, Mark replied. But manipulation is. Mark explained what Evan hadn't anticipated. Cameras don't just record images. They record behavior. The flickering streetlight wasn't random. Evan had timed Daniel's collapse to occur during a light fluctuation, knowing motion blur would erase clarity. But he miscalculated one thing. The human body reacts before it collapses. Daniel's shadow moved toward Evan before impact. A reflex. Fear. That movement created the impossible shadow. A signature Evan couldn't delete. Then Mark revealed the final piece. During the 9-second window where the light stayed on continuously, something blocked the sensor. Not a body. A raised arm. Evan had instinctively shielded his face. A human reflex. Caught forever in light. Evan stopped smiling. 7 years of preparation. Undone by instinct. By humanity. The thing he thought he had erased. But Evan still believed he was untouchable. Because Mark didn't have jurisdiction over the laundering operation. Because the statute of limitations was close. Because systems protect their architects. So Evan stood up and said, You've got a theory? Mark let him leave. Because Mark wasn't building a case. He was setting a collapse. Over the next month, anonymous packages arrived at regulatory offices in 3 countries. Shipping logs. Financial trails. Security architecture diagrams. All traced back to Evan's designs. International investigations don't knock politely. They arrive quietly. And they don't leave. Evan Reed was arrested 2 months later. Not for Daniel Cross's murder, but for financial crimes so large they made the murder irrelevant. Once the system cracked, everything spilled out, including the truth. In a sealed testimony agreement, Evan admitted what happened that night. Not out of guilt, but out of calculation. Daniel Cross's case was reopened, officially. This time the CCTV footage wasn't dismissed. It was understood. The same footage. The same frames. Seen differently. Michael Cross attended the private hearing. He didn't cry. He nodded. Because he knew his brother hadn't disappeared into darkness. He had been erased. And then found again. Mark Hale closed the file himself. Not because it was over. But because it was finally accurate. Some crimes aren't solved by new evidence. They're solved by new eyes. By someone willing to stare at nothing long enough to realize it isn't empty. Evan Reed never confessed in a police station. There were no flashing lights. No raised voices. No dramatic breakdown. The truth came out in a private room behind sealed doors with lawyers present and cameras turned off. Because some truths are too dangerous to say out loud. Evan spoke calmly. He described the night Daniel Cross died as if he were reviewing a project. No emotion. No hesitation. Daniel had become unpredictable. He was asking questions that threatened systems designed to be invisible. Evan said he didn't intend to kill him. That part was true. At least at first. Daniel was supposed to be warned. Scared. Controlled. But when Evan realized Daniel had already copied the data, panic replaced precision. One push. One moment of lost balance. One sound, soft, final, irreversible. Evan stood there for several seconds, watching Daniel's body settle into stillness. Not shocked. Calculating. He didn't call for help. He checked the camera. He checked the light. He checked the shadows. Then he left. Because in Evan's world, survival wasn't about morality. It was about design. When the confession ended, the room stayed silent. Even the lawyers avoided eye contact. Because hearing the truth didn't feel like justice. It felt like exposure. Daniel Cross's case was officially closed again. This time with the correct conclusion. Homicide. But the public never heard the details. No press conference. No footage released. No names announced. Because the investigation didn't just reveal a murderer. It revealed a system that had worked exactly as intended. The CCTV footage was never made public. Not because it lacked evidence, but because it showed something worse. How easy it is to miss the truth when you expect clarity. How often crimes hide in plain sight. Mark Hale returned to the street where it all happened. Same road. Same camera. Same flickering light. Nothing had changed. And that disturbed him more than anything else. He realized something that night. The most terrifying crimes aren't the ones caught on camera. They're the ones edited by human expectation. We don't see what's there. We see what makes sense. Daniel Cross wasn't killed because he was careless. He was killed because he noticed something small. Something that didn't add up. And refused to ignore it. Years later, when asked why the footage was never released, Mark gave a simple answer. Because people would stop trusting what they see. And once that happens, nothing feels solid anymore. The camera had recorded everything. The truth was always there. Waiting. Silent. Unmoving. They said the case was closed. They said it was nothing. They said the footage showed nothing unusual. But one shadow told a different story. And sometimes, that's all it takes to expose everything.